Okay,
Yeah,
so
Kara.
welcome everybody to Doomer Optimism. I am back with a former guest, Tessa Carman, who is definitely a fellow traveler. We had an episode in the past on the Charlotte Mason kind of, approach to education and homeschooling. And Tessa was telling me about her uncle Dwight, who is like a total fellow traveler, and a really interesting guy. And so she suggested we could get him on. We finally roped him in after a long and busy summer for all of us. And so we're here. I'd like to welcome Dwight and Tessa. And maybe Tessa, you could give a just like a brief background on why you invited Dwight and then have Dwight introduce himself.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much, Ashley, for yeah, putting us on, and thanks Dwight for being here. Uncle Dwight. So yeah, I mean, Dwight has always been a uh just really interesting figure in my life, just like as a kid, just like, Uncle Dwight was always, a fun uncle, but also he was the uncle who was reading Wendell Berry and George MacDonald and kind of interesting authors and such. But also, he has been farming in Guatemala for many years and training, doing very diverse farm down there, Frutas del Mundo, where like he really grows everything, and also trains other farmers to be able to farm themselves and have their own farms. And uh, I got to visit several years ago now. It's been too long. I need to somehow come visit again. But it was very inspiring to see kind of the vision of I don't know, kind of putting down roots in a place, in a very different place from where Dwight's from. I mean, he and my dad were raised in a farm in Minnesota on a small, diverse family farm, uh, and then Dwight, you went off to Guatemala and had your own adventure, but have really rooted yourself there and had so many adventures. I can't, won't be able to get into all of them, um, but especially just kind of, I don't know, maybe one particular aspect is kind of uh, that I've really been fascinated by is kind of rebuilding those roots with the land and with people.
Mm.
Um, just like teaching Sunday school to the local kids, to, just like um, these small, seemingly small ways to just kind of reconnect things that have been broken. Um, so anyway, that's kind of the overall, some of the things that I love about Dwight, and he's also, um, yeah, a fan of compost toilets, as is Paul Kingsnorth. So I thought like, hey, you guys need to be friends.
Yeah, we had a
um,
compost toilet in Uruguay. So I want to compare notes living in Latin America, but Dwight, let me have you introduce yourself in your own words, whatever you feel like is important to share, and then we can get talking.
Well, of course, the most important thing is that I'm Tessa's uncle, and yeah, well, and I'm sitting at our family farm in Park Rapids, Minnesota, right now, and I'm planning to actually in 1 week get back to down to Guatemala. So people ask me where where I want to be or where I'm most comfortable, and between the two places, and I remember marking the rough date when I had spent more time in Guatemala than in the U.S. and enjoy commenting to young Guatemalans that visit my farm that I'm more Guatemalan than they are because I've lived there longer than they have. But yeah, I'm sort of in this transition stage right now, so I guess I just like I think maybe going, you both mentioned the idea of roots, putting down roots, and I can go back to that. And as far as introduce myself, what I've discovered about myself is I put down roots comparatively easy. So when I um, sort of pulled up roots to leave northern Minnesota, eager to see the world, kind of, I was sent to Costa Rica by the Peace Corps to study Spanish, and I liked it. Wanted to stay there. Then I began my work in Guatemala with the Peace Corps and was put in a site um, supposedly to work with dairy farmers because that's what I had been focused on. And I thought this was the best place in the world. I want to be here. But there was a civil war going on, and so I had to move to a different part of the country. And there I stayed for about 4 years and just felt a deep commitment with the people and decided there that I wanted to uh, put into practice a lot of the farming techniques that I had been instructed to teach as a Peace Corps extensionist. And so then I put down deeper roots in Izabal, where my farm is currently. It's a very tropical part of Guatemala, and but it seems like we're uh, people talk about their home place or whatever. Whenever I see a piece of land even if it's just because I used to own a property in the city in Guatemala City, and it was just a little. I call it. I think Tessa got to see that. Well, she might have saw my cabin, but in front of that, I bought a little. I call it the cube. It's just this typical small family, 6 by 6 meter cement block cube on a 16 by 20 meter plot. And when I was sitting there, I just thinking like, what can we grow? Just like this is how can we make this as productive as possible and start thinking about, it's got a flat roof. We can fill that with plants. We can catch the water. We got a little area below. I can put some fruit trees on it. So, yeah, I guess I mainly just want to like to stay put, like to stay home, but my roots go down easily wherever I am land.
Yeah. Okay. So, maybe for your information, Dwight, if you probably don't know my whole backstory, but I'm from Chicago, grew up in the city, south side of Chicago, which is, we'll get into it. But anyways, I was like, should I stay in Chicago when I have kids? Before I had kids with my husband, and I was like, I really just don't want to raise my kids in this city. There's so much dysfunction. I'm worried about the school system. They're gonna put them on Adderall or something, and I want them to know how to like take care of land and have chickens and all this stuff around like learning how to live off the land and not be so disconnected from it in a city. So before I even had kids, my husband and I bought some land in Uruguay in South America, next to between Brazil and Argentina. For those listening who don't know where it is, and we just spent the last 7 years there. With my oldest was 3 when we moved, and my youngest was not yet born, and now they're 11, 8, and 4, 3 girls. And we moved back to Chicago, and we kind of had this tension of, where do we want the kids to grow up? What kind of life do they want to live? How to, whether or not we want to live away from family and miss a lot of those memories, but like, if I'm moving back to the United States, it wouldn't make sense to go onto some land because the whole point would be to get really close to family. And so we're just back in Chicago. So like this tension between like urban and rural, rootedness of people versus rootedness on land, like all of these things have just been, kind of consuming my life in the past decade or so. So I totally feel you on that. I'm wondering if you might want to talk more about like the tension, or yeah, like when people ask you where do you feel more comfortable? I feel equally comfortable in Uruguay as I do in Chicago, in the sense of like it's just was such a wonderful place to raise my kids. Everybody was so welcoming. It was such a functional culture. It was so nice to just be on our own land and have that freedom there, but like also culturally people were so warm and welcoming and very capable and very cool. And so in the US, I feel comfortable just because I'm from here and I like know how to navigate the city and the neighborhood and all the people here and that kind of thing. I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about like, I guess being an outsider to Guatemala, but now you've been there a very long time. Do you feel like you've integrated? Do you miss Minnesota? All of these things.
Yes, I think, our situations, just granted all those similarities, I think that one huge difference is that I don't have kids.
Yeah.
So I'm not, and so I'm not, I did, it's a huge factor. I started my farm in Guatemala with a partner who was recently married, and we like to kid around about how uh, our first durian tree was planted by his wife about the same time that their first baby was conceived.
Mm.
And and so the thing is that once they had a baby down there, their perspective, and I think Guatemala is a lot different than Uruguay.
Yeah.
We were living where our main access was on horse, and you had to cross a river to get there. And when it rained a lot, there was like 3 days where you couldn't get across the river.
Mm.
And so, I mean, as far as they decided very quickly with their baby that they were going back to California. But my attitude, being single, was more like there's a lot of people right here with babies.
Right.
What
Yeah.
and what are we going to do about like
Yeah,
what are we
right.
going to do about it? It's like um, um, so I had that flexibility to be able to stay put and kind of grow with the village and grow. My farm kind of grew with the village and like it's like the there's two generations that have been like the kids that were born there are having
Oh
there's
yeah.
it's almost when we have grandkids now since I've been there. And so as
Yeah.
far as feeling comfortable there, it's like I'm the local gringo, like el gringo,
Yep.
but so I'm an outsider, but it's like like the people, good share. Most of the village has never known life there without me. It's like I'm a part of the landscape there.
Yeah. That's
So
lovely.
as far as being in the same with local business, it's like, you know, people I do business with and stuff like that down there are just like, well, that's the gringo. That's our local gringo. It's like it's part of the. It's sort of like if you, I like in our little town in Park Rapids, there was the um, it was like we had one Jew in town. It
Mm.
was like, of course, we can't live without him. He had a little store there, and it's like, yeah, one. But it's
Yeah.
like it's not like he's an outsider. I think it's just like that's what he is as far as part of our community.
Yep.
So um, but see, I'm trying to remember what how um yeah yeah I got
And then just like
kind of lost the
any
thread. I got
no,
off
no.
there.
I actually there's a couple of things I want to respond to, and then I want Tessa to talk to. I told Tessa she's going to do this interview, but I'm like can't keep my mouth shut. I'm always excited to talk.
This is
But
this is why this is partly why I was like, you guys, you're gonna have great questions for
yeah,
each
yeah.
other.
So
So
okay,
go
so
go.
one thing is really like that I'm super ambivalent about is I actually think raising kids in hardship is really good for them. And the idea that like you should move out of there because you got to get in on horseback like that, I wanted my kids to like have a hard time getting around, to like have chores, have like not easily accessible consumerism, like not have peers who just have every new gadget and are on screens all the time. And so like I'm super ambivalent about that. The main thing we came to Chicago back to Chicago for was to kind of have these family memories and to, as our parents get older and less able to move around, to help them out with things. Um, but I'm super ambivalent about that. I wish it was harder. Like I try to make artificial hardship for my kids here. Like you, not artificial, but it's like you have to do chores. We're not just buying every newfangled thing. You're not watching infinite TV. You're not hanging around with kids who have cell phones, this kind of stuff. So I loved the hardship. I thought it was so cool to have them, like, there were times where we were on this little property set back from the road, and it's like a really lush country part of Uruguay where we were staying, like nearby the Rio de la Plata, is like tons of water, and it would rain several times a year to the point where we couldn't get into our property. And so it was like we had to walk across a flooded stream to get in and out and park on the other side. And sometimes we'd have to carry the kids across the stream and, like, tall boots or whatever, or try to drive through the stream. And a couple of times it got a little like rocky there trying to drive through. And so, yeah, those kinds of memories I miss, to be honest. But then the tension was just kind of like missing the family connections. And so I'm wondering if, you came back to Minnesota. Do you come back regularly and stay connected with your family here in the US?
But yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, to be honest, a huge factor is this sort of communication.
Mm,
Um, I think it's uh, one of the prompt questions that Tessa had sent to me is like, how have things changed in Guatemala since you've been down there? And the village I live in uh, never had a telephone service, so nobody knows what that is. I can tell old timer stories about how, when I was in the Peace Corps, it was like it took one day to make one phone call, and if the line was busy, well, spend another day, come back
that's
to
it.
try and
Come
make.
back tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so but the village, the kids that grew up in the village I live in, they all they know is cell phone. They don't know anything about a telephone line. Second, and so I mean, it's like in like the ability for me to talk so easily with my family now
Mm,
and friends or anywhere in the world now makes it so different. I mean, it's a
yep.
huge thing. And the other thing that's huge is that, we had, when it was really muddy and raining a lot, well, the horses had a hard time getting through, and so we had to walk through the mud. But now, and when you put a road in, and now people, especially the younger kids, they can't imagine life without motorcycles. It's just like
Yep.
I feel like I'm surrounded by I want some peace and quiet, and it's sort of like I just hear motorcycles humming around
I
all the time.
know. Yeah.
It's like,
It's so
yeah,
funny
how
because you,
I'm like,
you you go to the other side of the world and you just think like maybe you'll escape some of this stuff. And then it was funny because right before we moved back from Uruguay, like some of the same kind of weird ideologies, fighting about race stuff was like coming into my kids' friends in Uruguay. That my daughter had a friend who they got in like a kind of a tiff about. There's these crayons, and the crayon had color piel, like the color of your skin. And she's like, well, this isn't my skin color. And so this is not right. This is racist and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, it's like different skin colors come in different colors. And like, you could just use brown if you feel like more comfortable with that and blah. And it was just like, this kind of identity politics fighting about unnecessary things. I'm like, oh man, we like left the US so we didn't have to deal with this kind of stuff. So sorry I cut you off, but continue the change.
I think that yeah, and there's a way which um I left the U.S. for possibly this definitely didn't have to do with my kids, but I was really focused on at that time on the dairy at our farm.
Hmm.
we had a herd that my dad was so proud of his purebred Ayrshires, and I was in charge of that dairy, and trying to improve genetic improvements, and we were trying to like we wanted to have the highest producing purebred breed herd in the country, and
Mm.
there's another guy from Minnesota was just always better than us, but we sure like this. It was just a healthy, fun
Competition.
competition.
Yeah.
But at the same, so I was really into that. But the flip side of that was that it was just, I mean, I don't know, it had already been going on for quite a while, but it was about ready to really accelerate in the dairy industry, where we were milking 30 cows, and you start looking at the economics of it, and it's sort of like, well, if we're going to keep on, we're going to have to go to, you know, at that, it sounded big to say 50 cows or 100 cows.
Right.
Well, now if you do that, it's just like, what a joke. You can't make a living with that.
Yeah.
And so, it just seemed like in the milk price, it's sort of like, here we are just, like that time, I think there was like one of the Jurassic milk gluts. And so like, here we are just doing everything we can to produce more milk. And, and it's fun and everything, but
The
why?
economics. Yeah, the
Yeah,
economics are pushing you out.
well, it wasn't in that case, it wasn't the economics, because we were diversified. We had other stuff, and we could write it out. And it was just the concept of just being, working, making my goal in life to produce more milk
Yeah.
when there's already too much milk around. And so like, what's this?
Right. Oh yeah, right.
And then so I wanted to see the world, and Peace Corps pays your way to do it. And so I took the first job offer they gave me was work with dairy farmers in Guatemala, and I I didn't end up working with dairy farmers because the lady whose place I was taking worked with chickens, ladies in villages with their backyard chickens,
Yeah.
and they're like, that's where I realized, well, okay, the stark contrast where I could work to help people get enough food to eat like a chicken once a week instead of corn and if they can't afford the beans, just corn and salt or whatever, tortillas and salt or whatever. So it's like was much more fulfilling to try to help people do that than to try to produce more milk when there's too much of it.
Yeah, right.
And they get caught up in the okay, bigger equipment, bigger,
The
but
treadmill.
scale, treadmill, and to try to um, and plus it was it was great to and to be focused on people more than
Mm.
production.
Yeah, right, right. Tessa, did you want to jump in? Oh, you're on mute. I saw your parade of
Okay.
children coming in. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, just kind of dealing with they're doing great.
One after the other, yeah.
So one thing I was thinking about, especially talking about this last part of the background of being on the dairy, working on the dairy farm in Minnesota, and then kind of getting kind of realizing that the treadmill of more and more and more and bigger equipment, and kind of asking, wait a minute, why are we just creating more is this at the expense of other good things, of just like a healthy, not even just like our own farm, but just like a healthy, society,
Yeah.
it's like what's the, what we don't want to be, just zoom in like, okay, just might make the biggest buck you can and then get out of there. So that reminded me of how so the farm that my grandfather started, he was raised on a farm in Michigan, moved to Minnesota as a rural missionary, and and started a farm there. And so that has always been very diversified, like tomato, lots of crops, tomatoes, sweet corn, strawberries became a really big thing. Also dairy cattle, as dairy cows, as Dwight mentioned, beef cattle, and then sometimes chickens, sometimes you know a, a, a spell of sheep, or just lots of stuff going on. And so that's where Dwight and my dad, amongst 7 siblings, were raised. And the interesting thing about one interesting thing about it is that it's kind of had this continuity where all these other, you're growing up, for my dad's generation, you're growing up in a place where like you're surrounded by other farmers. Just like, oh yeah, like here are the farmers and stuff. There's like the local baseball diamond was down the road from the farm. Now there's like almost none of those farms are there.
Yeah.
Right? They all moved to the city, or and right, the farms have gotten huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Here's the corn, here's the potato fields, and here are the huge tractors, right? And meantime, my grandpa's farm, which is now, it's like, yeah, it's kind of, as Dwight said, it's kind of in a transition period where Dwight's been stewarding it recently, and it's kind of like, okay, ready for the 3rd generation, but kind of like right smack in that transition period. But you had, yeah, like I remember my dad talking to old timers, people who are 80, and they're talking to him when he's about 40, and he would know how they were raised because he was raised on, like, did similar, I guess you could say, more traditional things at his farm. That these guys are like, oh, you young whippersnapper, you young, you know about that,
Yeah.
you're so young. And then you guys, like my aunts and uncles, that you guys kind of, there's just been that continuity where it's not like the past was just had like this complete cutoff point. We're like, okay, get big or get out, right? Like we're going industrial. It's always been like, it's kind of always been like an actual small, diverse family farm operation. And so it's been really, so I guess, so I'm thinking, Dwight, about the Guatemala farm, where that's like the similarities, like differences, because there's not like your own kids there, but you have a community there. You've had godchildren. It's a very diverse farm. And so I don't know, like there's kind of there's a carrying on of that heritage in Guatemala. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that, that's that's what I'm seeing. So, but and I guess along with that, if you want to mention some of the projects, I'll just mention some really quickly, but like chocolate, that cacao beans that are grown in Guatemala and processed in Minnesota, that's been one recent project. So you can get Carter's chocolate, feed the bar, but yeah, you've got jackfruit. You've been really into rambutan. I remember visiting the farm, years ago, and realizing the world of exotic fruit is ridiculous. The whole world. It's not just apples and oranges, you guys. So, but yeah, if you want to talk about just kind of the connection of heritage, and then kind of the different projects that you've worked on at Frutas del Mundo through the years.
Well, first of all, I'm waiting for Atticus and Cosette to get back because they have to help me pick the potatoes. And what I love about it, besides the fact that it's fun, because they're 4th generation, to me it's really exciting and the tractor I wanted to use on it is actually actually right now we're using it mainly for like a photo op when people come to our pumpkin fall festival. But it's a Farmall A that my grandfather had, and when I see the children of Tessa's generation driving that tractor, well, that's the fifth generation on that same tractor, and it's still working and still going good,
Mm,
and it's still applicable for our scale. Um, but that aside, as far as like the diversification or a diverse farm, and that my dad was really um, and he was huge on that. His father was more likely to go big scale. And I think that if he would have been like his father, who did things on a much larger scale, he he might have our farm would have our whole heritage might have been completely different.
mm.
I remember he would get the option to buy more land, and I would look at it and say, "Well, that's a great option. It's cheap," and he just wasn't interested,
Mm.
and just didn't want to. This is enough. And besides that, no matter how cheap it was, he thought it was too expensive anyway. But
But also it changes the whole dynamic of the operation then. You're
right,
just
and like we have some neighbors, the Becker family, and it's just like they're one of the biggest neighbor farmers, and their father, I remember he was just sort of like get the new equipment, get big, and
right.
we we kid with Todd, who he was Todd Becker, who was I'm sure Tessa knows he was out with my older brother picking strawberries and looked at my brother's little 1 acre strawberry patch and says, "No, you got to get big. You got to get big." And politics said, "It's already too big for you. I don't want to."
An
And the same
acre of
thing happened.
strawberries is a lot of work.
Yeah, right. And so in uh in 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 Guatemala, once after 20 years, when my farm was actually paying for itself, after it took a long time.
Mhm.
My my neighbor, I've had neighbors as well. You gonna expand? You're gonna buy more land? And I thought it's too much already. I want to get smaller. But yeah, I think that's so I just go back to giving my father like his influences. He was a very strong personality, and seven of us siblings, and I know that Tessa was around him enough to know his perspective on life, and so when I was in the Peace Corps, taking that like my time in Guatemala, I kept seeing I saw lots of people. Most of the people I worked with were subsistence farmers who they raise corn and beans, milpa. I don't know if they have that in Uruguay, but the milpa culture is where you have in the North America the Three Sisters squash,
Mm.
corn, beans.
Not
But
no,
it's
that's not that far south.
yeah, yeah. But anyway, definitely a Central American, Mexican, North American. Those crops are so prime and it's for subsistence and very important. But they so you say corn and beans, but it's mainly food because mixed in there they're having all kinds of greens and they'll have some fruit trees in there. So it's a very intense and complicated little plot of land. And the challenge was that a good share of them, if they didn't get good rains and stuff, the corn wouldn't be enough to feed their family till the next season.
Mm.
So they grew up in accustomed to migrating. They would migrate, but internally, like they'd migrate to the coffee plantations
Mm.
and leave. Like the father would go off, or sometimes the whole family go pick coffee, go cut sugar cane, pick. Back in those days, there was still a cotton industry. They would go pick cotton, pick melons. So there was a tendency to like work on plantations
Mm.
and then and come back, um, supplement the income until they could put in their own crops. Or sometimes they put in their crop and then go work and come back and harvest. But uh, I was challenged by the idea of getting my own little plot and just see whether I could raise enough to eat or whatever. And then inspired by the my my partner at first introduced me to the world of tropical fruit and the potential,
Mm.
and so I like to. There's all kinds of terms nowadays, for for the you know regeneratives, the one of the later ones,
Yep.
like there's the Steiner's biodynamics. There's
Yep.
all kinds of concepts in front of it. I always like the word integrated,
Mm.
like integrate livestock with crops, with um, food crops, with a cash crop, something to pay the other bills you have. So that's what I wanted to do, and our focus was, as Tessa said, was on rambutan because we saw that as a real potential as a cash crop.
Mm.
My dream with my part, Mike Lee was my partner, and he was more of a saw the potential economic potential of a rambutan plantation.
Mm.
But we immediately started bringing in all kinds of different fruit trees, and he was recently married, and when we bought our property, there was a river that goes through, and he says, "My kids are going to swim in that river." So
Mm.
he had that. He's thinking about his kids there, but a lot of other kids swim in there.
Right.
They're
Right.
very Cal. But
Yeah.
um, uh, yeah, the idea of going back to like this integrating, uh, uh just right now, well, it's a long story, but right now we have we still focus on fruit trees, tropical fruit trees, because the idea in that specific climate is was a rainforest that had been cut down and basically wasted with uh, improper efforts to raise uh, corn, rice uh, as a cash crop,
Mm.
uh, soils that couldn't handle that, and then became a pasture. And the idea was to look for alternatives that would be a permanent tree cover, would provide income and food for. And so now we have like I have maybe 100 different species of fruit trees with that supply basically material for a nursery. So my main business is selling plants of tropical fruit trees,
Okay.
and, then but we have goats that live off of like jackfruit branches that are lopped off. We actually planted 4-H peanuts under there with some gramíneas so that they harvest that for the goats, and then we have ponds with fish and um, the people that live on my farm keep chickens that can range free within that. So we have, well, not poultry, lots of different kinds of poultry, and we have some pigs to feed the garbage to from all that.
Mm.
And so then we also have a processing facility so that anything fruit that we don't sell, cacao beans that we can process and do value added on that. So yeah, I really uh, like the idea of a small piece that's intensely managed,
Mm-hmm.
and and it's satisfying that about I have 20 acres and 15 families are making their living off of it.
Oh, that's cool. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, a little bit of like background about Guatemala in general. Did people like before you or like what was the approach to farming? Are you influencing the local approach? Is it kind of a back and forth, like this integrated of various livestock and using the livestock along with the orchards and these native fruit trees and plants, all that? Is that like something people were already doing? Were they doing it in the past and stopped for a while and started again? Or, just what's the history of that and what's your role in the.
Well, definitely uh, in the in the parts of the country that are were populated uh, pre-Columbian times, and then even up till before the industrial age, let's say,
Hmm.
and before the introduction of plantation agriculture. There was that was the whole milpa. The milpa was that's pre-Columbian, but still it was adapted by the colonizers. And
Mm.
Guatemala still has over 50% of its population is Mayan
Mm.
descendants, and what happened in my and so that's deeply ingrained into the culture.
Got
And
it.
like when there's a Guatemalan Mayan guy that has a little plot on my farm here in Minnesota, and it's just fun to watch what he packs into one little area there. He keeps some chickens on. He lives in the city and doesn't have in town, not the city, but doesn't have a place in the land. So he asked, asked if he could keep some chickens on that place, and then he
Mm.
can't resist. So that's one reason I think that when Central Americans, Mexicans, Guatemalans, when they come to the U.S., they're not afraid of working on. Well,
Yeah.
part of it, the long, like migration to work on local plantations. Well, so like it's not a big jump to anymore. It's not a big jump to work on plantations in the U.S. or
Right.
uh,
And
but
did they integrate livestock previously, or is that kind of like now
oh huge
livestock's more accessible and therefore people
oh
are using
huge
it more?
oh huge for sure you know pre-Columbian the only domesticated livestock in Central in the Americas or that part of the Americas were turkeys
Mm.
and possibly dogs for consumption. But there's no, I mean, you can't, like the lady that's been my cook for the last 35 years, her attitude is like, how can you be a woman and not have chickens? It's like she's judgmental about like her grandson is her grandson's wife is just she just really doesn't like chickens that well. She just doesn't want to keep chickens, and she's sort of like, that boy needs a good wife. What could she, that
I
she
love it.
doesn't want to eat
I
chicken.
love it. We should
And
bring that to the US, that kind of judgment
it's well,
attitude.
I mentioned that because when I discovered that early on in Guatemala because I went to work with uh supposedly I'll say there was a donation of some nice dairy equipment
Mm.
to a cooperative, and so but they couldn't get enough milk to keep the processing facility going, and they asked Peace Corps volunteers, well, we need some Peace Corps volunteers to work with the dairymen to up their production so that they can get better milk production and supply that. Well, I quickly learned that if you have a few dairy cows, um, you're comparatively wealthy, and some gringo that can hardly speak Spanish doesn't know anything anyway. We can humor him, and I discovered that the reason they didn't have milk for the dairy processing facility, these guys had other places to sell their milk and others. They didn't, and if they didn't pay enough there, they didn't sell it there. So that wasn't the problem. And those weren't the people that needed the most help. It was it was people that were getting whose chickens were dying with diseases that went through all the time. So uh, following the Peace Corps volunteer that had been there before me, back in those days, you didn't the terminology was completely different. Now back there, it was just becoming news to talk about women in development. It's
Mm.
like the concept we got to include women in this. And so she was a leader in women in development. And since I took over her work, I worked with lots of ladies and their chickens,
Mm.
and it was just probably one of the most satisfying things that anybody ever told me was a lady from a village that says, our chickens all used to die. Now we have chickens. We have chickens all over the place. It's great. We have chickens
Yeah.
because we just had a vaccination program. We would vaccinate them. So I taught people how to go vaccinate their chickens. But
Nice.
it's really, and I think that's like a simple, or have an impact on the world. You're like, well, those people know how to vaccinate. They have chickens now.
Yep.
But it's really so. Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. I in my the times have changed. Like we're well, it's there's all kinds of looking factors. Like where I live is a place that's recently because it's lowland, humid, and a lot of it's hot, really hot, rainy. It's not comfortable. It's
Mm.
uh before malaria was under control, it's like hard to live there.
Right.
And it was like the um and it was a place that was still isn't necessary, it isn't really adaptable to the in my opinion, it's designed for permanent tree cover, that climate. So it's not designed to the traditional milpa, and that when a lot of the people come in and try to adapt that system to it, it doesn't work. And so um a lot of what I do is working to show a system that hopefully it does work better like that.
Yeah, and your system is integrated livestock and trees more so than like the annual crops.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I
cool,
mean,
and it's neat to think like, you're the gringo in the town, but you have like an ongoing relationship where you're experimenting with things and then, selling plants and showing people how it works, and there's some back and forth both with the local culture, but then with your knowledge. It's like, yeah, what a cool existence. I have a quick question. Well, actually, I have a little tirade to go on, which is this book right here, A Small Farm Future. If you haven't already read
so
it,
that it was prominently displayed.
do you like it? Have you read it?
No.
Oh, you should read it. So, this guy, Chris May, she's been on the podcast a bunch. And he is a British guy, and he basically is like, we're in just a historical blip where these farms can exist, these giant farms can exist with these giant machines, and the whatever kind of resource limitations, you name it, between energy or chemical, ag, and fertilizer limitations, whatever it is, we're going to have to go back to a small farm future. And so I'm thinking about how you described your dad, Dwight, and I'm wondering if, Tessa, you have any memories of your grandpa, like this type of person who doesn't expand, who knows the limits and has like a strong idea of what he wants out of his farming operation and to like protect that kind of culture. Seems like kind of a rare person historically. Everybody just kind of goes with the tide, and I think it's interesting, that you guys came from this, patriarch who has a strong vision. So I'm wondering if, Tessa, if you have memories of your grandpa that you wanted to share.
Yeah, yeah, as Uncle Dwight said, yeah, very, very powerful personality, but also just a very, yeah, definitely a mover and shaker is often how my grandpa's been portrayed. And his dad was quite a patriarch as well. Even though I didn't meet him, but so yeah, he was, yeah, had very, he was just absolutely fearless. Doing what he thought was right, no matter what other people are doing. But I think, yeah, one thing that I grew up with stories of and I could see it, just the creativity.
Mm.
Yeah, stories of creativity and seeing it. And that continues with, like, yeah, all my aunts and uncles. I've got one uncle who's he's done a lot for the farm. So like ran it for many years, and he's incredibly creative. And It's like could number all sorts of things he's done, but so I see that heritage being carried on, but there's this, yeah, it's like there wasn't this question of, oh, one, if everyone else is doing it, that's not a good reason to do anything. Like, why would you do that? And I remember in my grandpa's memoirs, he said, sheep taught me a lot about people. People are like sheep, they run with the crowd, all the time.
I love it.
And I love it, and it's such a healthy, and it's not, and it, you can become stubborn in all the wrong ways, but at the same time, man, we could use more, just kind of like, why would I do that just because everyone else is doing it?
Right, critical thinking, right?
Yeah, but what did happen was, my grandpa he would figure out these ways to be creative with what he had, and to draw on the people around him to help out with it. And so it wasn't like, oh, we're always going to do things the same way all the time just because we did it earlier. Like, we were like, oh, we have, I think this is, Dwight can correct me, I think this particular thing happened on my grandpa's dad's farm, but they made field greenhouses with like old bus windows to put like here, leaned against each other, and got the earliest tomatoes anywhere around, because they reused these old windows to get the earliest tomatoes. But things like that, like, really, my grandpa painted beautiful signs. It is little touches like that, just like he'd sell tomatoes on the side of the road, and that became a bigger thing, such that he and his the sons built a timber frame like barn to sell food from, be like their own market, and just a beautiful building. So there's this eye for and above all, my grandpa always he always wanted to work for the glory of God. And so that, I think, really, he did really live that out. And just like, yeah, like, again, if everyone else is doing something, it's not a reason you do it too. And that goes along with, like, well, if you're with your faith, like, well, you trust in, like, your faith because in God, because you believe it to be true, and not because just everyone else is doing it and you just kind of going along with it. And so, and he really, yeah, I don't know. I think that kind of bringing in of people, and yeah, my grandpa wasn't like, he wasn't, my grandpa and grandma are very kind people, but they weren't like, oh man, we're hosting things all the time. And I like, kind of like the Southern hospitality sort of stereotype, right? Like, they weren't that. And yet we had so many, like, they were very welcoming in their own kind of maybe more reserved Midwestern way, of so many different kinds of people would, visit the farm, become part of it, and then get roped into the work. This is what I remember getting, as a grandkid, like, we're going to go visit the farm. We're going to do fun things. And also we're going to sort tomatoes and pick a lot of strawberries. And, you're here, you're going to work. So I think like the way things, I think he took pride in doing good work. Like Dwight said, like the cattle being like, I love these cattle, like the Ayrshires, just have, like, really loving that, but also he just was able to keep in perspective things that, I think partly because he was so stubborn and didn't care what anyone else thought.
I love that. Yeah.
And
one thing I would add is, and I like, maybe we could kind of wrap up with Dwight's perspective on this too, and whatever other thoughts you wanted to share, is one thing that has always struck me in my travels and living abroad is I know this sounds cliche, but how similar so many of these kind of techniques and ways of life are. And my book is my dissertation I wrote on what I called subsistence agriculture in the United States. And it's like nobody wants to call it subsistence agriculture if it's happening in the US, like even though it is literally the exact same stuff of like fruit trees and bees and chickens and like small livestock and it's all literally the same, but it's like well it doesn't count as agriculture if it's like just in your backyard if it's in the US, but it does like in the developing world. And there's this like bifurcation between like farming for profit and farming for subsistence and like just making all these arbitrary lines between people, and it's just so cool and interesting to think the similar kinds of processes of development that happen in Minnesota uh, are happening in Guatemala and taking different forms, but people are just kind of trying to scrape by, make a living, be healthy, have enough calories, and enough protein, etc. So it's similar it's just interesting all these similarities. And I'm wondering, Dwight, if you have anything to add either on this idea of the small farm future, or how you resist these kinds of things, like how you be a personality like your dad. Just I guess final closing thoughts as we wrap up.
Mhm.
Well, it definitely has to be attractive for one reason or another, and
Mm,
uh, to, to for like it's not the um, economics are a huge attraction. Like make more money, get more things, are just a right they're like a vacuum sweeper that suck people in.
yeah.
And there was I remember in like this like we have this negative connotations around subsistence farming, but I mean I got to some of my heroes are subsistence farmers. It's just like there's this old guy that that I remember the last time I saw him, he was getting old. He had a pile of corn behind his house, and he just said, "I just thank God that this wonderful harvest for like it was like one wagon load here, but he had it out there, and it's just like there it is. We have it. We have enough corn to last till next season. It's just like what a wonderful blessing. We have our food. There it is, piled out there, and enough to feed some chickens too. And so, but his kids. Well, his son has actually had that same vision, but his grandkids, most of them are in the States working at some whatever. Um, um, but and I think of a farm I visited actually in North Carolina. I was just thinking about with all the storm that hit North Carolina. There's a farm called the guy called it sustenance farm. So he found a different terminology for it
Mm,
instead of subsist like barely subsisting. No, this is sustenance. We can
yeah.
sustain ourselves. But I remember talking with him. He says, and I looked at his farm and I liked the whole concept and everything. He says, yeah, well, my kids just want to look at the computer all the time. Like
Mm.
it wasn't attracted to him. So how do that's the huge it's in it. By
Yeah,
I
I mean, I
had
think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
well, yeah, it's just that's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's
It's
really
really
like the big question of like life, religion, humanity. It's like all that glitters is not gold, And like I think a lot of
yeah.
people, for example, you'll leave your I've talked to people on my world travels, like you'll leave this beautiful village. It's hard work, it's physical work. But sometimes you reach these points where you have enough, you can rest for the season, you can relax, you've grown it, and you're part of this community. It's in this beautiful place where you're from. But I talked to this one guy, I think I was in Costa Rica, he was a Nicaraguan, and he was like, yeah, but like I want to go to the US, or no, he was in Costa Rica to try to save enough money to like buy. He kept saying like I want to buy a Nintendo Wii for my kids. I want to buy a video game. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh man, it's like all that glitters is not gold, dude. It's like, what I mean, it's like, God, these kids who have that, the difference in like the quality of meaning, and connection and like, resilience and ability and all this stuff. But, and it's like, of course, there's a million people in development. As who are you to say as a rich Westerner, like what kind of resources these people should have be able to access or whatever. But I think it's just good to talk about. I think it's especially good for a mostly Western audience, developed world audience, to think about making sure you integrate some of these lessons into your life. And do even a part of the thing of this podcast is, even if it's just a small thing in your yard, like you were talking about some of these Guatemalans who live in the village, and they just want a little bit of chickens and have a little couple fruit trees, and just even continue a cultivation of the land no matter where you're at. Yeah, that's great, and I appreciate you sharing all of this. Any final words as we wrap up, either
Yeah.
from
Well,
Dwight or Tessa?
I'll have to read that book, and I would say that, like, yeah, the what I see in the future is like, when I look at where I am right now in Minnesota. We're in a it's central sand plain, so it's dependent on center pivot irrigation.
Yep.
Our and it's potatoes run the show. They're alternated with by a big those potatoes supply a big processing facility that supplies McDonald's, Burger King,
Yep.
tater tots. But uh, on the corners of those pivots, there's there's square mile sections that on each corner there's places that aren't irrigated,
Mm.
and I just use like resources you just mentioned, like when it all falls through, like doesn't work anymore. Well, it would be nice to be able to still irrigate that somehow. But meantime, I just think that we got to repopulate. There should be houses on every single corner there should
Mm.
be little plots of people farming those little corners, uh,
Right.
uh, food, raising real food, and then eventually maybe like if the big if the big guy goes broke, um,
And you've got people
then
out there on the
they
landscape
can share
already.
that. You can share that pivot and raise all kinds of different stuff on it. And
Yep.
if the economy changes so that that's where they get their sustenance, then they'll be happy to. I mean, and so my my focus, what I'm really interested in doing at on Carter's farm here in Minnesota, is keeping the opportunity open for the next generations to
Mm.
learn to know how to do it, to be able to do it, to not be shocked when it's all of a sudden here.
Yeah,
It's just a skill.
that is
Reading,
one of
writing, arithmetic, and
yeah.
raising food. It's like
I love it.
gotta
Yeah,
know how
that's
to do it. You gotta know how to do it. Even
Yeah,
if
that's one
you,
of the
you may,
main themes of this podcast is basically once you lose that knowledge, it's really hard to get it back. It's really, really hard one to get it back. And so the more you can get kids just inundated with this like kind of inherent knowledge about how to manage landscapes and animals and plants and this kind of thing, like it's so much harder as an adult when you're like starting from scratch and you're making a million mistakes because you didn't even learn some of the basic heuristics about like physics and nature and like the like basic things that you learn just by kind of shadowing your parent or uncle or whomever is taking you along. Okay, so that's great. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and raising
raising food.
raising food. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dwight. This was lovely. And it was so good to meet you. Hopefully we cross paths again. And Tessa, I'll see you next week.
I'll be following your blog.
All right. Thanks. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
All
Bye.
right.